What's going on, you bunch of heathens? Hope y'all are doing well. We are going to be doing part 3 and part 4 of the Path to Pearl Harbor today. Should be pretty fun. I'm actually really enjoying this. This might be a channel I come back to watch some more videos on. But without further ado, let's jump in.
Hanoi, September 22nd, 1940, 2000 hours. General Maurice Martin, commander of French forces in Indochina, sits in a humid meeting room with a general of the Imperial Japanese Army. They're working under a deadline, for in 2 hours, Japan will invade. This had started in June, just after France fell, with a demand from Foreign Minister Matsuoka to cease shipments across the border to China and allow Japanese border observers. But as the months dragged on, the ultimatum has increased. Now, Japan wants the border totally closed and to station troops, ships, and warplanes in northern French Indochina. It's egregious, but Martin has little choice. The Japanese 22nd Army is ready to cross the border at 2200.
Yeah, no, that's a shitty fucking position to be with. Your actual nation fucking fell, and now you're stuck dealing with one of its allies, and you have no actual support. Yeah, no, that would fucking blow. Because you have no fucking support. That is one of the shittiest positions you could ever be put in.
100 hours. He makes a counteroffer. How about 6,000 Japanese troops, not 25,000? The general agrees. Whew. An hour before the deadline, word goes out that an agreement has been reached. But when the deadline comes, the 22nd Army invades anyway.
I mean, I'm not really that surprised.
Thanks so much to Ground News for sponsoring today's historical tale. Japanese diplomats hadn't expected the Indochina operation to go like that. Theoretically, this was supposed to be part of a diplomatic expansion south, one that was to be accomplished amicably through negotiation. After all, Japan was Germany's ally, and Germany now controlled France. I mean, why wouldn't France just let them in? But again, at this point, Japanese diplomats weren't really running the show. Rather, militarists in the cabinet were directing foreign policy.
Yep, because I forget, I might have been Fat Electrician on one of the, when Stakui came on. He was talking about how basically, or was it Stakui or Fat Electrician who said it? I don't remember. From what I remember, it was basically the, what's it called? Yeah, the military was basically in charge overall. During this time, the military really had almost all the power, and the actual civilian side of the government didn't really have much fucking power over anything at this point. The military had gotten too big.
Now, and even though Foreign Minister Matsuoka, a man who'd led Japan's exit from the League of Nations, was himself a militarist, even he still had limited power. The military considered the civilian foreign ministry unreliable, and rarely shared their plans with Matsuoka or his subordinates. I mean, they'd sent a general to negotiate in Hanoi, not an ambassador. Meanwhile, low-level military officers were provoking conflicts again, like launching a needless invasion of French Indochina, despite receiving word of a diplomatic solution. And to be clear, we're not talking about a small border
SMH.
We're talking a multi-day undeclared war with tank formations and amphibious assaults. Now, a few months later, the Foreign Ministry did successfully act as a mediator to end a short war between Thailand and French Indochina, but that didn't really change Japan's image as a military aggressor, and at the White House, Roosevelt most certainly still felt that way. Over that chaotic summer
it's just building up worse and worse.
He'd been taking all the actions he could, pitching them as defensive in order to avoid backlash from isolationists. In May, he'd stationed the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, where it could credibly threaten Japan should it try to move south, a move the Navy disliked since it split their fleet and kept it far from its home base. He'd also made diplomatic and congressional moves on what would eventually become the Lend-Lease program, which you can watch our video about here, supplying the UK and other not-quite allies with old military equipment. And after the fall of France, he'd pushed
a bill through Congress known
as the Two-Ocean Navy Act, expanding the U.S. Navy fleet size by 75%. Not only would this allow the U.S. to simultaneously fight a war in both the Atlantic and Pacific, the expansion focused on aircraft carriers and naval aviation, modernizing a badly aging fleet. In September, he reinstated the military draft, and he began efforts to harden American defenses in the Philippines and Guam, and transform the civilian airstrips on Midway and Wake Islands into Navy air bases. America would not seek a war, the reasoning went, but given the march of German and Japanese aggression, it needed to be ready to fight one. But after the aggression...
It was Teddy. It was Teddy. Speak softly but carry a big fucking stick. And the U.S. needed to get a bigger stick at this point in time due to all the tension.
In Indochina, Roosevelt wanted to directly target the Japanese military. So, he expanded the embargoes of the Export Act to also cover iron and steel scrap, metals crucial for war production. In response, the Japanese ambassador in Washington met with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, calling the metal embargo an unfriendly act. The United States was intervening in diplomatic negotiations between allies, he said, where it simply had no part. Besides, Japan was merely trying to stop illegal weapons shipments to the corrupt nationalist regime in China. But Hull knew that argument was a smokescreen, because a U.S. military program known as MAGIC had secretly broken Japan's new diplomatic cipher, Purple. While the decryptions weren't total, and many of the messages were
Oh, so this is what Kvetch was talking about on the last one. How we were actively deciphering, but we couldn't exactly actually say that. That's cool.
Difficult to understand due to code words and poor translations, one thing was clear. The moves in Indochina were part of an expansion south. Yet relations did briefly improve. In November, that ambassador was recalled and replaced with the genial Admiral Nomura, who immediately bonded with Roosevelt over their shared interest in naval matters. Furthermore, Hull and Nomura got along well, meeting regularly at Hull's apartment, where they could be more candid, and Nomura always kept an even temper, even when the two clashed, believing to his core that a conflict would be bad for both countries.
That's actually really cool. That's a really good sentiment for a politician to have. That's actually really cool to see.
But what Hull and even Nomura didn't realize was exactly how much Roosevelt's attempt at deterrence was in fact driving Japan closer to war with the United States. In Tokyo, military and civilian leaders were terrified over Roosevelt's expansion of naval power, because this wasn't just the U.S. leaving behind the naval treaties of the 20s and 30s. This meant new American carriers, destroyers, cruisers, and airplanes coming off the production line every year for the next 5 years. Currently, the US and Japan had roughly equal navies, with Japan having a slight advantage in merchant vessels, but now that America was on a war-producing footing, that might only last a year or two. So an argument started to circulate. If a war was inevitable, why not fight it soon? After all, every day Japan waited, the US Navy was getting larger, and if Roosevelt cut their oil, the opposite would be true. Each day of non-combat operations would mean Japan had
Don't
less
touch
fuel
the
to
oil.
fight. Japan's attempt to manufacture synthetic oil had failed, and when they made import deals with Mexico, the US leaned on its southern neighbor to get those canceled. Foreign Minister Matsuoka, however, had a solution. Deter US action by signing a tripartite pact with Europe's totalitarian states of Germany and Italy. Nazi diplomat von Ribbentrop had first suggested such a thing as early as 1938, and to Matsuoka, it made immediate sense. Germany was one of the few nations to recognize Japan's Manchurian puppet state. All three wanted to deter the US from joining the war, and by signaling a mutual defense pact, it meant America would need to fight a two-ocean conflict.
Shake my head. Yes, it was getting closer to war and all that, but Jesus, the more in trying to head off the war and trying to kick the US early, you just set it off earlier and you pissed us off. Like, it's not smart to do. It's not smart to piss off a fucking nation you're already scared to fucking go to war with.
Germany also pledged that the Pacific would be Japan's sphere of influence. Matsuoka's concept of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The idea that Japan would throw Western colonialists out of Asia and lead the region to prosperity. Though it should be noted, not everyone was on board with a Nazi alliance. In Tokyo, one colleague warned that Hitler was untrustworthy and routinely violated treaties. After all, Hitler had already broken his anti-communist pact with Japan by signing a non-aggression pact with Stalin, and he hadn't even bothered to inform Tokyo in advance.
Yep, there's that. Also, in the coming years, or whatever, or however long it is, I'm not exactly sure where we're at in the timeline. In the coming bit, he then proceeds to betray Stalin and invade Russia. So no, Hitler wasn't fucking trustworthy. You should have fucking trusted the fucking politician for once.
An alliance hadn't helped them in Indochina after all, and once the pact was signed, Matsuoka had to issue embarrassing statements saying Japan wouldn't be adopting Germany's anti-Semitic policies. But Matsuoka remained committed to the alliance, especially because he believed the Soviets could be enticed to join, forming a bloc of totalitarian nations to challenge the Western democracies. And in 1940, the alliance bore fruit. November 11th.
So even you're not that sold on the anti-communist pact, huh?
11th, 1940, 250 miles southwest of Sumatra. Officers of the German commerce raider Atlantis board the merchant vessel. They'd come upon it disguised as a fellow merchant ship, then fired at the bridge at close range, killing most of the command. Now they're taking passengers and crew aboard their own ship before scuttling it. But then, one of the passengers asks an officer if they could go get her family's tea set in the ship's vault. And when he agrees and goes to retrieve it, the officer finds more than just porcelain. 15 bags of top-secret mail destined for the British Far East Command. There are maps, decoders,
son of a bitch,
intelligence reports, and a special bag filled with holes so it would sink when thrown overboard. Documents inside detail Britain's plans for the defense of...
You dumb bitch. Really? You are a dumb bitch.
Singapore. Troop strength in the region.
God
and how
damn.
the colonies would fight a potential war. The assessment is grim. Currently, Britain cannot win a fight with Japan. All 15 bags were forwarded to Tokyo, their reception causing a massive stir. The Strike South plan was not only feasible, it should begin soon. But wait, what of the American fleet at Pearl Harbor? If Japan took the Dutch East Indies, it would surely respond. Yet a group of naval officers felt otherwise, arguing that the U.S. fleet could be preemptively destroyed at the commencement of hostilities, giving Japan a year or two to consolidate its wins in Southeast Asia before having to fight the Americans in earnest. It was worth developing a contingency plan.
Don't touch the boats. Don't touch the boats.
The British had used a fleet of carrier-launched torpedo bombers to raid an Italian port. They should get someone to study that possibility. Lucky for them, one man was eager for the assignment. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Oh man, Zoe, can you imagine how all the public-facing stuff in this story was being reported in the news back then? I mean, it was probably being covered very differently in the United States than it was in Japan. At least today we have access to ground news.
Don't touch the boats. Don't touch the boats.
Honolulu, Hawaii, April 12th, 1941. Tadashi Morimura, the new vice consul at Japan's consulate general in Honolulu, is unusually daring for a civil servant. A private pilot, he rents small aircraft to fly around the island and swims the southern waterways. He also visits the geisha bars favored by local Japanese and visiting naval officers and loves chatting up the girls for gossip. And
Ooh, is there any big reason for that? Oh, he's flying. Could he be taking notes? He likes swimming. Could he be taking notes on that? Gossip. Well, we all know the military are a bunch of horn dogs.
He lives unusually far away from work, 8 miles to be precise, in a second-floor apartment overlooking Pearl Harbor. Now,
that's
if
a
that
bit
all sounds
strange
odd to you, there's a good reason, because that identity is a cover. In reality,
oh wow, imagine
he's
that.
Ensign Takeo Yoshikawa of Imperial Japanese Naval Intelligence, a specialist in U.S. Navy warships. His job is to provide descriptions of the harbor and monitor which vessels are in port. And he reports this information back to Tokyo via diplomatic cables. Cables that, he has no way of knowing, are being read by the American military. The countdown has started. Thanks so much to NordVPN for helping to keep us safe on the internet. For a 2-year plan on a huge discount, use code ExtraCreditsVPN at nordvpn.com/extracreditsvpn. April 13th, 1941. A train station in Moscow. Foreign Minister Matsuoka and the Japanese delegation are in high spirits. They're slapping backs, hugging, many of them a little intoxicated, after a celebration banquet. For half a century, Japan has feared an attack by Russia, but no more. Over the last several months, Matsuoka has been negotiating a non-aggression pact between Japan and the Soviet.
Oh no, but because they're in an alliance with, because Japan's in an alliance with Germany, when Germany invades, that goes up in flames. Oh no.
Soviet Union, and today they signed it. And as the conversation on the platform dwindles, Matsuoka turns to see an unbelievable sight. Walking through the crowd is Stalin himself, come to see Matsuoka off. This never happens. Stalin doesn't go to the train station to give diplomats a personal farewell. And it's at that moment that Matsuoka...
That would be pretty fucking terrifying if you see this dude. Like, nah, bro, that should be fucking terrifying.
...feels the weight of history, and how badly the Soviets wanted this arrangement. Now, Stalin can withdraw troops from its border with occupied Manchuria and send them west, and Japan, for its part, could remove their own troops and push south. But when Matsuoka arrives back in Tokyo, he found that plan had become a bit more complicated. For in Washington, Ambassador Nomura had hashed out a draft resolution that could normalize relations with the US. If Japan would agree to withdraw troops from China, merge its Chinese puppet state government with Chiang's nationalist government, and pledge to recognize Chinese independence, the United States was prepared to recognize Manchuria as a Japanese possession, normalize trade, and end racially discriminatory immigration laws. And Prime Minister Konoye was considering it. After all, he wanted out of the Chinese quagmire. And while it might come off as a betrayal of the Japanese soldiers who died in China, it could prevent thousands more from dying.
Should have taken the deal. Should have taken the deal.
In a Pacific-wide conflict. Matsuoka was livid. He insisted that the draft be shown to their German allies and said that the time to attack British Singapore had come. After all, he'd spent over a year forging diplomatic agreements with Germany and the Soviets to keep the pressure off Japan. And what, now they were just gonna give in? Matsuoka started to go rogue. He made a counteroffer where Japan gave up nothing and started to denigrate Konoye in public. Worse still, once Nazi Germany broke its non-aggression pact and invaded the Soviet Union in late June, he insisted that Japan should abandon the Southern Strike and instead invade the USSR in support. Konoye, deeply embarrassed, had to personally apologize to the emperor for Matsuoka's conduct and give assurances he did not plan to provoke a war with Stalin. In fact, the fiery diplomat's presence had even become a sticking point in negotiations, with Secretary of State Cordell Hull suggesting that talks could not go forward with Matsuoka still in government. He also demanded that Japan quit the tripartite pact. And when Matsuoka started to act without consulting the cabinet, Konoye decided it was time for him to go.
Fuck's sake, bro. That's a fucking sinking ship. Like, you're really gonna fucking go rogue and be like, god damn. I mean, yes, I can see why he'd be pissed. All your work going down the drain like that, but at the same time, you can't be like that. You really can't.
So his ministers dissolved the cabinet.
That's fucking ridiculous.
It without him. In Washington, Roosevelt and Hull were overjoyed. With Matsuoka,
as I can see why they would be.
Cooling off of military aggression. Their hope was misplaced. 4 days later, under the threat of military action, Japan had reached an agreement to occupy the southern portion of French Indochina, moving into air bases that would allow them to bomb British Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines. A hard response was needed, and Roosevelt delivered. He announced he would formally cut relations, put an embargo on goods, and freeze all Japanese assets in the United States, with that last measure cutting all American oil sales to Japan. Yet days later, he gave Nomura a new offer. Pull out of Indochina.
Yep, I do know this part. I do know that us embargoing them and taking not letting them take oil from us, or buying oil, or whatever you want to call it. I do know that was actually a fairly big fucking part in why in the build up to this. I do know that part.
And make it a neutral territory, and the assets would be unfrozen. See, the US oil embargo wasn't a full embargo. That would leave Roosevelt without much flexibility in negotiations. Japan obtained American oil by buying licenses to purchase a certain volume, and Japan had already obtained enough licenses to keep them supplied until 1943. But that oil had to be paid with U.S. currency, held in American banks, and those were the assets that were frozen.
Yep,
Though,
you can't buy it if you don't have
the Treasury
assets
Department
there.
could decide on a case-by-case basis to allow Japan's license purchases to go through. So Roosevelt could, essentially, loosen or tighten Japan's supply of oil in a carrot-and-stick approach. Nomura didn't even pass on the proposal to Tokyo, knowing that the militarists, especially Minister of War Hideki Tojo, had boxed Prime Minister Konoye in. On August 1st, the economic measures went into effect. Yet Roosevelt's measured approach was not followed. As he took a 2-week diplomatic visit to meet Churchill, the Treasury went hardline and denied all Japanese oil purchases. Then, given the popularity of this tough stance among friendly nations, Roosevelt retroactively endorsed it. What he didn't endorse, however, was coming to those nations' defense. All summer, British and Dutch diplomats had tried to get Roosevelt to commit, even informally, to fight together should Japan attack in Southeast Asia. American diplomats instead ducked, saying negotiations with Japan were ongoing and the time was not right. In truth, Roosevelt was unsure that the isolationist American public would support him going to war, even if Japan attacked. Would American parents, he wondered, accept their sons dying just to hold on to the Philippines or preserve British control of Singapore? At the time, probably not. But Roosevelt's attempt at deterring war again did the opposite.
But then that changes in December.
With over 90% of its oil obtained from the U.S. If war was coming, every day they waited to strike south, they would have less fuel to...
That totally seems smart, huh? Let's fuck with the people who give us our fucking oil. Like, there's two things with America you don't fuck with. You don't fuck with our boats and you don't fuck with our oil. That's standard. That's just in general. That's almost any nation. You don't fuck with our... A main thing with any country is you don't fuck with the oil. And your military leaders in your government are fucking with your own nation's oil because you decide to try to play hardball with where you get it from. That doesn't seem very fucking smart.
To operate with. Under wartime consumption patterns, they predicted they could only keep their ships moving and planes flying for a year. So, their options now were to either pull out of China, which the army wouldn't accept, or strike south. And yet, American negotiators dawdled. They were in no hurry, each day seeming as if their hand in a potential war grew stronger. Over the next several months, Prime Minister Konoye tried desperately to find a middle ground, including brokering a face-to-face meeting with Roosevelt in Alaska. Meanwhile, the planning for the strike south, with an optional attack on Pearl Harbor, advanced. The plan had gained formal approval as a contingency should negotiations fail, but militarists increasingly found that Emperor Hirohito did in fact favor a diplomatic solution. At a meeting on September 6, 1941, a militarist officer told Hirohito that a war with the United States would be over in 3 months. Not believing this, the emperor pushed back, saying that they'd said the same thing about China. China is big, explained the officer. Bigger than the Pacific? The emperor responded. And he finished the meeting by reading a poem.
Also, are you seriously trying to say that? Are you trying to say that the U.S. isn't big? Like, what's your thought process there? China is big. Yeah, so is the fucking U.S. and so is the ocean. The fuck do you mean by that?
His grandfather, Emperor Meiji, had written on the eve of the Russo-Japanese War, a poem about how the sea linked all nations and should be at peace. But he did give his assent to war if diplomacy failed. And as the weeks dragged on without progress, and the Alaska summit looked doubtful, pressures began to mount. And at a conference on September 25th,
are they going to try to sabotage the diplomacy?
Deadline. If no diplomatic options were reached by mid-October, Japan must put in motion plans for a military solution. It was agreed. Fleets began to gather and make ready. October 12th, 1941, near Mount Fuji. Konoye has brought the biggest figures in government to his private estate for a last-ditch effort to prevent war. There, he leans on Tojo, saying that he's not confident a war with the United States can be won, and that he's not equipped to lead the country through it. He threatens to resign. He also enlists allies from the Navy who privately oppose the war and think that defeat is likely, but who are also not brave enough to make their anti-war views known amongst their colleagues. The best he can get from them in the moment is to say that
why they'd be scared about it
was a mistake and that they'd asked for imperial approval of the strike too early. Tojo will not budge. The sticking point is what it's always been. The army refuses to pull troops out of China. Not only does Tosho see doing this as betraying the dead, but much of the army's political power is wrapped up in the war. After many contentious hours,
it's all about fucking political power. It's always about that.
4 days later, Konoye resigns from his post, and the emperor appoints his successor, Hideki Tojo, who tells Admiral Yamamoto to begin preparing his strike force for war. He, of course, didn't tell them that over the internet because it wasn't exactly a thing yet, but if it was, and he didn't want other folks listening, he definitely should have been using NordVPN. You know, again, in this alternate universe where the internet existed during this current time in history. You get what I'm going for. Now, if you follow some...
Okay. Well, that was part 4. We will continue with part 5 and part 6 at a later date, but I'm really enjoying this. This is actually, like, if I didn't do videos, I would definitely just sit here binging all these. Like, that is exactly what I would do. So I'm really hoping you guys enjoy these. Well, that was part 3 and 4 of the Path to Pearl Harbor by Extra History. Make sure you give the videos and the channel itself some love. They definitely fucking deserve it. Really good channel so far from what I'm seeing. Like and subscribe if you want to keep seeing me. And until next time, take care of yourselves.